Hello, and thank you for joining us for Preservation for Home Archives with Gabrielle Sanchez. My name is Laura Christensen. I'm the curator of manuscripts and archives here at the Thomas Balch Library, and we're pleased today to invite one of our former colleagues, Gabrielle, to tell you about how to preserve your home archives. This recording begins already in session, so to cover what Gabrielle talks about before the recording pops in, she mentions that today's presentation will cover paper, books, and photographs, but will not cover audiovisual recordings, digital media, disaster recovery, or complex conservation. And within the program, she will tell you a little bit more about what is meant by complex conservation. So as we join her, she is talking about the main ideas that will guide your
current condition, or as close to it as possible. And basically that comes down to storage and handling. When we talk about conservation, we're talking about repairs. And conservators are highly trained individuals. They are artists and chemists and historians and in a very highly specialized field. And I am not a conservator. And we really don't want to be doing any sort of conservation treatments that are beyond our expertise, because our second key concept is do no harm. And this again is, fairly obvious and intuitive, right? We're here to learn how to preserve our materials, not how to destroy them. And so, obviously we don't want to do any harm, but honestly, you would really be surprised. And a lot of times people undertake conservation measures that seem like a good idea at the time, but really have long-term consequences that cause lasting damage, and we want to really avoid that. So we want to think about making sure that everything we do is reversible, making sure that we're not using any sort of permanent adhesives or causing permanent changes to our items, and that we're really thinking through the long-term effects and not just looking for a short-term solution. And then our final concept, and this is sort of the most important, and it's also fairly intuitive and common sense, but I think it really helps to think about it in a very conscious way, is the idea of intrinsic versus informational value. So what does this mean? As I said, I'm an archivist and a special collections librarian. So like all librarians, I'm interested in the informational value of the items in my collection. So whether it's text or data or visual information, photograph or film, I'm interested in the information that's contained in those items, just like any librarian. But I'm also interested in the intrinsic value of these items, which is the value of these items as objects. And that's where an archivist kind of differs from a regular librarian in terms of preservation. So if we were to imagine that we're all librarians and we have in our collection 3 copies of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, and one is a first edition inscribed by Charles Dickens himself, and the second is a modern Penguin paperback, and the third is an ebook, the informational value of these 3 items is the same. There may be slight variations in between the editions, but overall, for the sake of argument, let's say that the informational value of these items is identical, but the intrinsic value of these items is very different. So the ebook is not a tangible item and has really limited, if any, intrinsic value. But our 2 actual physical books that we can hold in our hand are both objects, but their value as objects is very different. And this plays out when it comes to preservation. So if we were to get a tear in the cover of our first edition and our paperback, we are going to treat those very differently. And that comes down to the intrinsic value of these items. So with our first edition, we may take a number of steps to limit the use of the item. So if it's a circulating item, which it probably shouldn't be to begin with, but if it was, we would maybe take it out of circulation to reduce handling. And we may also put restrictions on it and say that, it really can't be viewed at this time, even if a researcher does come to look at it on site. We may make a custom housing for it to protect the cover. We may employ the services of a conservator to repair the book. We are not going to do that with our paperback, right? We're probably just going to throw it away, deaccession it, give it to the book sale, whatever it is, and order a new one from the publisher. We're not going to go through the trouble of preserving this particular item because the value of this item is really not that great. Whereas we're not going to throw away our first edition and just order a new one, even though we probably could. So when we think about intrinsic value, we're thinking about the value of the item and how we're going to make preservation decisions in order to preserve that value. And when we talk about value, the first type of value that most people think of is monetary value. And this can be important. I think that when we're talking about our own personal family archives, monetary value is probably not necessarily the most important, unless you happen to have prominent people in your family. Your items are probably not going to be worth more, worth a lot of money to other people, and they're worth something to you, and that's good enough. But monetary value is a way to gauge intrinsic value. So in our Tale of Two Cities example, in 2019, this copy of A Tale of Two Cities, which was inscribed by Charles Dickens to a Mrs. Cowden Clark, who was a contemporary of him, obviously, but is maybe not so well known now, sold at Sotheby's in London for $137,000. By way of reference, you could probably buy a first edition of A Tale of Two Cities now, depending on conditions, starting at around $10,000. So $137,000 for this one that was signed and comes with a letter by Charles Dickens. In 2014, a copy of A Tale of Two Cities inscribed to George Eliot by Charles Dickens was offered for sale for the equivalent of $350,000. So monetary value is a thing, and it can be affected by these other types of values. So there's the value of association, right? So, in this example, the association with other prominent people affects the value of the item. There can be just the value of something's age. Something can just be particularly old. It can be rare or unique, and that is something you want to preserve. It can have an aesthetic value. It could just be a beautiful thing. There's research value, which as a professional is the value that I'm most concerned about. So is this an item that researchers are going to be interested in, and are they going to be coming to my repository to look for it, which are two slightly different questions. And then finally, there's sentimental value. And I think when we're talking about our home archives and our personal papers and our family's papers, this is the most important type of value. And this is not something that you're going to put a number on or a monetary value, and it's really a decision that you need to make for yourself. And as I said, all of these things are kind of common sense and intuitive, but thinking about them clearly and consciously and really making decisions about how you're going to spend your time and your money in order to preserve things, and really thinking about what the most important things and prioritizing is going to be really, really helpful for you, and really thinking through what it is that you are preserving. I'm going to, as I said, talk about the different materials, paper and books, and then photographs, and talk a little bit about their history and development, and what we should do to preserve them. So I'm going to start off with paper. Paper was invented in China in the 3rd century AD, and it came to Europe in the 18th centuries. Prior to that, in Europe, for writing material, they which are both made from animal skins. And the way that paper is traditionally made is that water and other materials are mixed together into like a slurry and then spread over a box called a decal box. And there's a screen, and the water evaporates and sort of drips down, and you're left with paper. Traditionally, paper was made from plant fiber, so cotton, linen, and hemp. With industrialization, of course, modern paper is made from wood and trees. Trees contain within their cell walls a substance called lignin, and that is what causes modern paper to become acidic and brown and fragile and crumbly, and all of the things that we associate with paper kind of deteriorating. Older papers made from plant fibers or rag paper don't have these qualities. And so all other things being equal, if you have a document from 1720 and one from 1920 that were kept in similar conditions, the document from 1720 is going to be in better condition, all the time, just because of the nature of the materials from which it's made. Modern paper isn't made in sheets anymore, it's made in large rolls, and this process hasn't really changed all that much from when it was first invented. When we talk about books, books Traditionally, you would have those sheets of paper and they would be folded into these bundles called signatures, which were then sewn together. And then they are encased within boards and, other papers to form the book itself. And so traditionally, your bookbinder and your printer were two different people because these were two different professions. And so if you were to buy a book, you would buy that from the printer and it would just be the text block. And then you would take it to a bookbinder and the bookbinder would bind it according to your specifications. So if you think about like an old world library where it has all of these leather-bound volumes and they all match, that's because, a bookbinder would have bound books however the person who owned the book wanted them to, and you wouldn't have bought a book like this off the shelf like you do now. So as I said, the number one concern with paper, especially modern paper, is, that they become brittle and fragile. And this is a natural oxidation process. There's really nothing that can be done to stop it. It is what happens to these materials over time. But we can do some things to sort of lessen the effects. And so, one of the things we want to do is unfold our papers. If they're folded, they're more likely to break and crack along the fold. So if you have letters and envelopes, you want to take them out of the envelope and store them flat. Most things you do want to store flat and things like that to minimize any sort of breaking or cracking along the weak spots. One thing that people did in order to preserve documents was to laminate them. And so lamination was invented around the 1930s and was used pretty regularly from the 1930s up until the 1980s. And it is a process that uses heat and adhesives and is really not used anymore. There's really nothing that can be done to remove items that have been laminated from to remove the lamination. As I said, it was used really widely. The Library of Congress's copy of the Emancipation Proclamation was laminated. Where I work at the National Anthropological Archives, they laminated a whole lot of things, but one of the saddest examples is they hold the Sitting Bull's pictorial autobiography, which includes his drawings of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And as the curator of North American Ethnology says, you could use those as a placemat. And, it's really a national tragedy. Lamination really cannot be undone. There have been some experimental techniques, but it's really mixed success. It's something you want to certainly avoid going in the future. If you have any laminated items, there's really not much you can do about them after the fact. Tape. So a lot of times, you have a piece of paper and it's torn and, you think, oh, I'm just gonna put a little tape on there. That's really not the best idea. Over time, the tape loses tackiness. It will leave a mark where the tape was, and then you will be left with two stained pieces of paper, where in the beginning you just had two pieces of paper. So you don't want to tape things back together. And if you have tape on your items, you can try to remove it. If it's still pretty tacky, I would leave it alone. Eventually, I promise the adhesive will dry up. But you can take a spatula like you see here in the picture and try to lift it up, and it should pop right off when it's ready. So as you can see, here's just more examples of damage caused by tape. And then the next thing is metal. So, we use a lot of metal to keep our papers together, paper clips and staples and binders and binder clips and straight pins and all of these sorts of things. And they rust and they discolor the paper and they cause weakness where they have been affixed. So we want to remove all metal from our collections. Another thing is rubber bands. These become dried out and tacky, and they kind of stick to your paper, and you want to avoid that as well. When you're removing staples, you want to avoid using any sort of office sort of staple remover, which I don't know if anyone has ever been able to use these without ripping off an entire corner of their paper, because I know, I've never been able to do that. And so what we use is a metal spatula, which is the item here at the bottom of the screen. And what you do is you take the spatula, you flip the paper over upside down so that the ends of the staple are sticking up, and then you insert it, the spatula under the staple to make it straight, and then you flip your paper back over and lift the staple straight out. And that way you can remove the staple without tearing your paper. So now you're saying, well, if I remove all my, paper clips and my staples and all of these things, then how am I going to keep my papers together? And that's a really good question. And you have some options. So the first thing you can do is to use stainless steel or plastic paper clips. They sell these, plastic paper clips or stainless steel in any archival supply catalog. And the best way to do it would be to not apply the paper clip directly to your items, but rather to make a little strip of paper, or you could use Mylar and put that in between the stainless steel paper clip or the plastic paper clip, and that will prevent the paper clip from sort of damaging the paper underneath. Another thing that you can do, and this is my preferred method, would be to make a little mini sleeve out of a piece of acid-free paper, and then just put all your papers in there. And this has the benefit is that you being able to label your sleeve with what is in there. So, in this case, it's labeled, this is like a memo. This is from the NAA, a memo. It has the date and the number of pages. And you could also, your personal items, you could have it. This is a letter from, Aunt May to Grandma Joe, and it had 3 photographs in it and this news clipping and all these things. And that way you know exactly what was in there and if anything becomes missing or lost, and it's all together. There's pros and cons for using the plastic clips or using a sleeve like this. If you use a lot of the plastic clips, what can happen is that in your box, especially if you put all of the clips sort of in the upper left-hand corner where you would tend to put them, is that it can become very uneven in the box because they are pretty bulky. And you can spread them around. They also have a tendency to get caught on other things, which I don't really like. With using this acid-free paper little sleeve, acid paper can be very expensive, and it can also, if you're making a lot of them, it can really bulk up your collection if you don't have a lot of storage space. This is just adding extra paper and bulk to your boxes. So, it's really up to you what you want to do. A third option is to not use a paper clip or a staple at all. And in many cases, this is really the best option. I can't tell you how many folders I've been through where there's only one stapled bundle in there. I mean, if it's only one group of items in folder and they all go together, that doesn't need a staple. They can all be loose in there. Where you may think that, really think about whether or not that staple or paper clip is really providing any additional information or keeping things together, or whether it's sort of just there and whether or not you really need it. So there's that. And then thermal paper. So these are like old faxes, and I mean, I don't know if anybody really has any particularly valuable old faxes or old like thermal receipts, but if you do, the ink from the printer does fade over time. And so as you can see in this example, this document had been written on, and the ink that was handwritten is totally fine and really easy to read, but the original document itself is starting to fade. And so in this case, the best thing to do would be to make a high quality photocopy of the original document while you still can. You can save the original if you want, you can discard it, that's up to you, but just preserving that writing while it's still visible is important. And then mold. So mold is something you want to take really seriously. It can affect your health, and it's one of those things where the more you're exposed to mold, the more sensitive to it you become over time. You don't sort of develop a sensitivity to, develop like a tolerance to it. It will make you more and more sick, and so you really do want to take any sort of mold seriously. When I was in grad school at Indiana University, the conservator there was named Jim Canary. And he had developed such a sensitivity to mold over the course of his career that he would break out in hives if he was exposed to it at all. And so if anyone was working on something and they suspected that it might be mold, they could just show it to him. And if he broke out in hives, you would know that was moldy. And they called him the canary in the coal mine. And this is maybe a good party trick, but it's certainly really not great for this man's health. And it's not something you really want to happen to you. So you want to just be really careful when you're dealing with anything that might be mold. Mold can be active and it can be dormant and it can be dead. Active mold is sort of smeary. So if you use like a glove finger and you smear, it should smear. Dormant mold or dirt even will brush off like dust. If mold is dormant, it can come back to life. So just because it's a little dusty doesn't mean that under the right conditions it can't come back. So this is kind of one of these situations where you really want to be thinking about your, intrinsic value and what you want to preserve, because mold remediation is not something you're really going to take on your own. If you have a little bit, and it's something you're not particularly, maybe not the most valuable item you have, you can maybe take it outside on a sunny day and let it air out. And that's really, the most that you can do sort of at home. What you really want to do is to segregate your materials. So anything you have that you suspect has mold, you want to, take it away, box it up, wrap it up, so that it's not going to spread to everything you have. And then you can make a decision about whether you want to deal with find a specialist who can help with mold remediation, or whether maybe you just want to let these things go. So what we have are materials and our papers, and they are all, unfolded, and all of our tape is removed and our metals, and we have everything organized the way we like, which is a completely separate discussion. We need to think about our housing. So we want to put our items in folders and in boxes. And this is a manuscript box. You can get boxes like this, or you could also use acid-free, like regular banker's box. It doesn't have to be this style of manuscript box. It's really, really important that when you have your folders in your box, that they lay even and flat inside the box. And so your folders are going to have a crease in the bottom, and you measure what's in there and you fold your folder along the crease so that it creates a flat bottom. What happens is if you don't do this, there's like this tectonic plate action inside the box, and folders become subsumed under each other. And if they're like that for years and years, the papers inside are going to become warped and damaged. And so you just want everything to be sitting upright as much as possible. Sometimes we don't have enough material to fill a box, and so you can get a spacer, and you can use old folders. You can buy spacers, which are these boards that you kind of fold up and put inside your box. It's really important that your spacer be placed in the box correctly. There was some madman at the NA put all the spacers in the boxes backwards. So they're doing the complete opposite of what they were intended to do. So you can see that if you put it with the flat edge against the box and the bent edge against your papers, what happens to that folder is it becomes warped and damaged. So you want the spacer is there to make sure the folders are flat and upright. And so it's important that you use the spacer the correct way. If you're going to put books in a box, you want to do it with the spine facing down. If you put it with the spine facing up, which is sort of, I think, the way most people would tend to do it, so that you could see what the book is, right? Because you can read the spine. Over time, the weight of the text block is going to pull on the spine, and it will separate. So ideally, you would store your books on shelves, but if it needs to be in a box, it should be with the spine facing down, or it could also be upright. With this, like it would be on the shelf, but inside the box. When you're going to remove a book from a shelf, the way to do it is not the way that most people do it, which is to just grab the book by the spine and yank it backwards. If you have a book that's particularly, fragile, what you want to do is take your two fingers and push the two books on either side of the book that you're interested in, and then use your hand to really grab onto the boards of the book and pull it out. And that way you're not going to cause any damage to the top of the spine. So with books, a lot of the problems have to do with the spine and the text block falling out and things becoming separated and things of that nature. And so the easiest way to deal with this is to use a phase box or any sort of custom enclosure. You can get these things custom made, and they're really fancy. You can go to a company and they'll make these beautiful enclosures for you, or you can buy from an archival supply company these materials, which are these two sort of pieces of cardboard that are, roughly the size of your book, and you trim them down, and they come with little Velcro buttons, and you can make a nice little enclosure for your book, and that will help protect it from further damage and give it additional support. One thing, and again, this comes back to the idea of, intrinsic value and informational value and what we're preserving exactly. So in this case, here is a book that was a ledger book for a company, and this company had a fire in its warehouse. And as you can see, the book was burnt. And you could, if you wanted to, take this to a conservator and they could replace the cover. They wouldn't be able to replace the text that was missing, so that is information loss, but they could certainly repair those pages and they could remove the burned edges, and they could make the, put a blank sheet in the center so that the holes were filled in, and they could make it look pretty good. And again, you would have information loss, but your book would look great. But if you did that, you would be losing some of the real, informational value that is here, because this book is evidence of that fire. And you can see the history of this company, on this book because of the burn. And so when we're thinking about things that we want to conserve and we want to have them back to their, original state, do we really want them back in their original state, or are we preserving the, the history that's contained in these items? And just some of the things that we might consider damage, do they actually tell a story? And so that's something else to consider when we're making these preservation decisions. So rolled and oversized items. Ideally, we would have everything unrolled and stored flat. This isn't always possible. Most people don't have mat cases in their house for storing really large items flat. And so sometimes, for whatever reason, you really do need to store things rolled. So you can buy a preservation rolling a tube. It's an acid-free tube, and what you're going to do is roll your item on the outside of the tube. You don't roll it up and shove it in the tube like a mailer. You roll it on the outside of the tube. So the tube is providing structure to your rolled item and keeping it safe. And then you would wrap that up in an acid-free tissue or maybe a bag of some sort, and that would keep the whole item safe, and you would be able to unroll it if you can. This is something you would do if your items are very flexible and they can be all rolled and unrolled without cracking and tearing and things like that. If you have something that is rolled but maybe needs to be flattened, the best thing to do is to find a place to lay it out flat, like a dining table or a large surface. And if you could roll it out without it, kind of cracking or breaking, you roll it out and then you can weight it down. You can buy special book weights, but you do not need them at all. You can use like an old phone book or a dictionary, just a large heavy book. If you place like a folder or some other sheet of, acid-free material between your item and your weight, so that the weight is not directly on your item, and just weight it down and just leave it there for a few days. Eventually it should be flat enough for you to be able to put it in a large folder and store it flat if that's what you want to do with it. Sometimes we have things that are a little, they hold their shape a little bit more and they're not very conducive to unrolling, and then you can't really unroll it without fear that it's going to crack. And you can attempt to humidify an item yourself. This is a little bit of a dangerous process because you are introducing moisture into your item, which is something we generally want to avoid. But you can attempt this if you're interested. So what you would do is you would get a bin, which is sort of just like one of these underbed storage bins, and a piece of like plastic grating, like from Home Depot or whatever. And you get like a towel or a dishcloth or something. And you want it to be damp, not wet. You don't want to put water in the bottom, but this damp towel. And then you put your grate on top, and then your item on top of the grate, because you don't want your item to be touching your moist item. And then you put the lid on and you let it sit, and you want to check on this frequently, right? This isn't the kind of thing that you're going to set up and then go on vacation for 2 weeks. You want to check on this, at least once a day and make sure that everything is okay, that there's no growth or no mold growth, it doesn't smell mildewy, that nothing funky is happening in there. And then, as soon as you kind of feel like you can unroll it and it's loosening up a little bit, you want to take it out and then flatten it out on a table like I described before. Newspapers. So a lot of times we have old newspapers, at home and things that we want to save. Newsprint is generally considered to have a very low intrinsic value. The quality of the paper is exceedingly poor. It's an ephemeral, material. It's meant to be, used for a few hours and then thrown away. And it's printed for the most part, in, hundreds, thousands, millions of copies. And so it's not considered particularly unique or unusual. And so when we find clippings in an archival collection that we're processing, very frequently we will make a photocopy and discard the original. And this is one of the few cases where it is very common practice to discard original material, and that's with newsprint. But you certainly don't have to. You can keep your newspapers, that's fine. Ideally, we would keep them flat in a folder. Like I said, most people don't have, cases and flat files at home. So you can also purchase specialty boxes for newspapers, and these come in tabloid size or broadsheet size, depending on what you need. And you can store your newspapers this way, if that is important to you. All right, so photographs. So photography was invented in the 1820s, and in the past 200 years, there have been numerous advances and changes in the way that photographic images are produced. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about all of this, because we're really going to treat a lot of our photographic material the same, regardless of the way it was produced. So, photograph has layers. So there's a backing layer, which, when we think about modern photographs, is paper, but is also film, for negatives, glass, metal, things of that nature. Can be a coating layer. There's the emulsion layer that has the image in it. And so we need to think about we're preserving all of these different layers together. And the most important thing to be concerned about is, disappearing images and really preserving the images that we have, because once we lose that image, then our photograph isn't really all that valuable. And in concert with that is the idea of labeling, because if we do not know who or what is depicted in the photograph, it has little to no informational value. It's just a picture of, something. And if we can't connect it back to people that we know, or, an event or a place, then really what are we preserving? It's just an old photograph. And so it's really important that we label our photographs properly. So here are just some examples of different kinds of photograph damage. At the top, we see a big old fingerprint. When we deal with photographs, we want to use gloves. We generally do not use gloves when we're dealing with paper, or books or those sorts of materials, despite what you might see on TV. Whenever you watch one of those shows where someone goes into, the archives, they're all wearing gloves, and I assure you that is not anything that happens in real life. I don't know why they do that on TV. It just confuses people. If you wear gloves when you're handling paper, you're a lot more likely to tear your papers because you don't have the same kind of manual dexterity. Unless you're dealing with an extremely important, old, fragile document, you're really not going to use paper or gloves with paper. But with photographs, on the other hand, you always want to use gloves because, as you can see, the oils from your hands can actually damage the photograph emulsion, and you will see fingerprints appear over time. And then the other picture on the right is some emulsion damage, and this is generally caused by changes in heat and humidity eating away at the emulsion of the photograph. And then at the bottom, this is the original glass negative of this very famous photograph, and as you can see, it's broken because glass is very fragile. And so we want to again be thinking about preserving all aspects of our photographs, the images and the backing layer. So we want to label our photographs, but how do we do this? Not like this. We want to use generally, what we use are these blue photo marking pencils. You can buy these from an archival supplier. They are not particularly hard, they're very soft. So when you write on the back of the pencil, on the back of your photograph, it's not going to push through to the other side. If you use ink, it can eat away through the paper of your prints, and you will see it on the front side of your photograph. And the same thing with a hard kind of #2 pencil. It is possible for that pressure to be visible on the image side, and we want to avoid that. So if you want to mark your photos, the photos themselves, these blue photo marking pencils are your best bet. And then when we talk about storing our photos, generally we use Mylar. Mylar is a brand of plastic enclosure, and this helps protect the photo because, as I said, we always want to use gloves, but you know, sometimes it's a lot easier to handle materials if you know, if they're in this a Mylar sleeve, then we don't have to worry about getting anything on the photo. We can handle it without, you know, fear, and it also helps protect the photo itself. And you can get them in all sorts of sizes and shapes for different kinds of materials, for, you know, prints and for negatives and for slides and all sorts of things like that. And if you you can also, if you don't want to mark your photos themselves, you can also write your labels on like a piece of acid-free paper and put that inside your sleeve with your photo. And that way it's together and the label is there, but you're not necessarily writing on the photo itself. So that's another option if you don't want to use the photo marking pencils. They can be a little hard to write with because they are so soft. So then albums and scrapbooks. So a lot of times, you know, when I tell people I'm an archivist, they're like, oh, I love scrapbooking. And I don't really like scrapbooking. And I think that most archivists kind of have a love-hate relationship with scrapbooks because they can be amazing, and they're little curated collections, and they can be really visually very, very interesting. And so from that perspective, they're really wonderful. But from a preservation perspective, they're very, very difficult because you're dealing with lots of different materials all together. So, you know, you're dealing with paper and photographs and, you know, things that are, you know, like newsprint or ticket stubs that are really ephemeral in nature and maybe not the highest quality photo. You can have botanicals like pressed flowers. You can have human hair. I once had a scrapbook that had a pocket watch glued into it. And then you're dealing, of course, with adhesives, and it's all in the form of a book. So there's a lot going on there from a preservation perspective. And so if you have a scrapbook that is in fairly good condition, then the best thing to do is to just leave it as is. You might want to consider getting a box for it to protect it a little bit. But if it's in good condition and everything looks good in there, you can keep it as is. If you have a scrapbook that is in poor condition, and if the condition really prevents you from looking at it or accessing it, you can consider disassembling it. Generally, this is sort of a last resort. You don't want to disassemble things because you don't want to take things apart. You want to try to preserve things as they are, but sometimes this really isn't possible. So you can disassemble a scrapbook. Ideally, you would take a photograph of the item and of every page to kind of preserve what it originally looked like, and then take the items apart and store them, you know, how they should be stored. So photographs are sleeved and papers are, you know, put all together, and the metal is removed if there's anything like that, and you know, things like that, and you keep the sheets all separate, and then you have all your items preserved. But again, that is sort of a last resort. But like I said, if your scrapbook looks great and your photos look good and there's no damage, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with keeping your photo album as is and enjoying it. The only exception to this are these magnetic albums, and these were super popular, you know, starting in about the 1980s. And I think, you know, we probably all have these somewhere at home. And if you have something like this, the best thing to do is to remove the photographs. Now, I personally have had really good luck with being able to just peel back that layer of plastic and take the photographs out. I have heard from people, and I think maybe once or twice I've experienced where the plastic sheet is really, really stuck on there. And so if I wouldn't force it. If you can't get that plastic sheet on, eventually it will give up and you'll be able to get it out. But if you have these at home, I would make this a pretty high priority to try to remove the photographs from these sorts of albums. Because as you can see, the paper is highly acidic. There's that tacky plastic on top that is not doing anyone any favors. And it's really just not a very good environment for your photographs. So framed items. So a lot of times, we have photographs or documents or whatever, and we want to have them framed and on display in our house. And this is great. From a preservation perspective, the best thing to do would be to make high quality copies of your items and put the copies in the frame and then store your original separately. Now, not everybody wants to do this, and that's totally fine. If you want to display your original items, you want to think about a couple of things. One is what materials are in your frames. So you have your mat, and there could be all sorts of things, especially if your item was framed a while ago, in the past. There could be craft paper and all sorts of other things. Things can be glued down. And so you really want to take a look at what's in there, because you're creating this enclosed environment that doesn't have a lot of air circulation, where your item is in there with perhaps these other acidic materials. And then you want to think about light exposure. You can get UV protecting glass, of course, and you want to think about where you're hanging it in your house. Are you hanging it in front of a bright open window that gets 6 hours of direct sunlight a day, or is it in more of a shadowy corner? It'd be better for it to be in a darker place where there's less light exposure, and then also to get some sort of UV protecting glass. And if you go to get something framed, there are lots of glass options for you to choose from. So setting up our workspace. So when we get all of our materials out and we want to do our rehousing and our preservation work, we want to have a big open space, and we want to avoid food and drink, smoking, candles, plants and flowers, any sources of water, and cramped and dirty surfaces. We really want an open, clean, clear space where we can spread out. Our hands should be clean. We shouldn't maybe put a ton of lotion on right when we're about to do this sort of work. You don't need to, as I said, wear gloves, but you want your area to be relatively clean. So most of us don't have a conference table in our house, but if you have a big dining table or a kitchen table, really being able to spread out is the best thing. You do not want to have to work in a really cramped space, because you're more likely to cause damage. And it also helps if you're sorting things out to be able to spread everything out and see what you have. When it comes to supplies, we've talked about a few of these, but there are some more here. So starting in the top left, that white long item is a bone folder, and so you can use that for making sleeves and enclosures, and for making those nice crisp folds in your folders, and also for making phase boxes. It just helps to create a really crisp crease in any sort of paper or board. And then the spatulas, which I talked about for moving staples and tape and things like that. And then there's book weights, which you can use, but you certainly don't necessarily need. You can use any sort of, relatively heavy object. Magnifying glass, which could be super helpful for really seeing what you're looking at. A soft bristle brush for brushing away any dust or dirt or anything like that, so that you have everything clean and tidy. The blue photo marking pencils and just regular old pencils, we want to avoid using any sort of pen around our materials, just because we don't want to create any sort of permanent mark. So pencil we can always erase, and that's why a really high quality eraser is also a good idea to have, and not rely on sort of the eraser on the back of your pencils, which tends to create a smudgy mess that's worse than whatever it was you were trying to erase in most cases. The Balch offers a little sampler kit of archive supplies if anyone is interested, and this would include a legal size document box and some folders and sleeves and sheets of paper and the spatula and the pencil and eraser and a pair of gloves, sort of to get you started. It can be a bit overwhelming when you're looking at these preservation supplies, and this can be like a really good way to sort of get a feel for what the supplies are like and what would be most useful for the kinds of materials that you have, without committing to buying a lot of materials all at once. And especially now, since this presentation is virtual, you may not really be able to, see what these, you may not be familiar with these materials. Normally, if everyone was here, I'd be passing around all sorts of supplies and you can kind of see. But anyway, there's the kit if anyone is interested. And then when it comes to storage environment, you don't need a climate controlled storage facility, right? You want it to be a comfortable environment. So, around 70 degrees and 55% relative humidity, basically what you would want to have in your house. Variations in temperature and humidity are much worse than a consistently maybe higher temperature or higher humidity. As long as it's consistent and within a certain range, it's okay. You want to avoid really a big variation. So you want to avoid attics and basements and places where maybe it's really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter, because that's going to cause more problems. You want to avoid sources of heat and water. So you don't want to be storing your materials in your basement between your water heater and your washer dryer, right? You want to store it in a place that is consistent temperature and not near a place where there could be water leakage and things like that. You want to avoid direct sunlight and artificial lights, right? Because we don't want things to be exposed to light. And we want to avoid putting storage containers directly on the floor in case there is some sort of minor flooding. We want things up off the floor. And we want to keep our area clean and vacuum and dust regularly. So I have this list of helpful websites. I think there's a handout maybe that'll go out also, which will have all of these on there. And so the National Archives and the Library of Congress both have websites, web pages devoted to preservation, and these are both meant for a general audience of the public. So they're not like highly technical or anything like that. It just has basic information about preservation. The Northeast Documents Conservation Center is a independent conservation lab. They're based in Philadelphia, and they contract with different repositories to provide conservation work and guidance and surveys. But they have a lot of information on their website and technical leaflets and things like that, which have information. It's mainly written for it's written for librarians, but not necessarily for specialists, so it's pretty accessible. The American Institute for Conservation of Historic Works, I have two websites from them. One, the Caring for Your Treasures page has information not only about the paper and books and photos that I was talking about today, but also about objects like furniture or jewelry or artwork, textiles, and also architecture. So they have a much broader range of information, which can be really helpful for people who are looking for information about other formats. And then if you're really into conservation and really want to get into the weeds there, the Cool Conservation is a group for conservators. So this is highly technical information, but if that's something you're interested in, you can certainly look there. And then Archival Methods is actually a company that sells library supplies. But they have a blog that has a lot of really good information, and this is written for a general audience because they're sort of, I think they do sell to libraries, but they're also direct to the public. And so they have a lot of information meant for a public audience. And then a tool that I have been using quite a bit is this collection ID guide. And this is really helpful if you have something but you don't really know what it is. So this could be like a photograph that you're maybe not sure exactly what type of photograph this is, what type of print is this? Is this an albumin print? Is this a platinum print or whatever? Or a type of, they also have for different types of paper and different printing processes and AV materials in different formats and things like that. And then it has information about the materials and when they were in use, which could be really helpful for dating things, and what they're made from and how they're made and what the kind of preservation pitfalls are and how they should be properly stored. So, and it has all that by format, so it's really helpful. And then when it comes to buying preservation supplies, I have information, I have some links on the handout. I would highly recommend buying from a library and archive supplier and not buying preservation supplies from a place like Michael's or like Office Depot. You want to look for things that are acid-free or lignin-free and, things like that. But there's really no regulation of these terms. So there's no way of really knowing what's in these products. And I think you're better off buying from a company that works with libraries rather than, someplace that, can really, who knows what they're actually selling, because there's really no way to tell. I can tell you that when I was at the Library of Congress, there is they order their supplies once a year for the entire library, and it's a massive order. And the order comes in, and then it goes to the library's lab, and all the materials are tested. And every year that I was there, at least some portion of this order did not meet their testing and got sent back. So if that's happening with materials that are being sent to the Library of Congress through these companies that this is exactly what they do, you kind of wonder what may be happening, at Staples, I don't know. But that would be my recommendation, would be to purchase from a library and archive supplier. And there's, on the handout, there's a list of the sort of most common ones. And then, to sum up, our main ideas are to do no harm, right? To not sort of go beyond our experience and, knowledge and expertise, because we don't want to cause long-term damage, right? We always want to be thinking about the intrinsic and the informational value of our items and what it is that we're preserving, right? How am I going to spend my time and my money, to buy the supplies, and what exactly is the most important thing for me to preserve? Here, when I'm looking at my materials and really thinking consciously about that. We want to keep everything, cool, dry, and dark, and use acid-free sleeves, folders, boxes, and properly and clearly label materials. Because if we don't know what we have, then all of our preservation work was really for nothing. A lot of times we're preserving this, we're saving our family materials for our future generations, and they might not know who these people are that are depicted in the photos without us explicitly, labeling and explaining exactly what it is. And so that's a really important part of the preservation puzzle. And that's about it. I have plenty of time for questions.
Great. We do have, and I'm going to come over here quickly and address the questions so people can hear me.
Oh, okay.
One question we had earlier on related to digitization, and I know you mentioned making surrogates, and obviously we can't have a full digitization class or conversation here, but is it possible for people to make scans for long-term preservation of the information at home without having to have a professional quality scanner?
Right. So digital preservation is kind of a misnomer. There are certain things that absolutely digitization is going to be the preservation method. And when we're talking about things that are born digital, right, where they don't have another format, then you need to worry about digital files and preserving them. And then when we also talk about audiovisual material, where the format itself, the tape or film or what have you, is going to deteriorate. Digitization is the preservation. That's the method. That's what you would do. For things like paper and photographs, digitization for preservation isn't really a thing. What you're really kind of doing is digitization for access. And by providing access to digital files, you're allowing your materials to be preserved because you're not handling them as much. So I know that's not necessarily, and I'll get to the actual question about scanning, but we need to kind of think about what we're preserving when we're thinking about digital preservation. So can you, make, scans and photos without some sophisticated setup? Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. And you can do that, but you need to be aware that digital files are going to require maintenance, that hardware and software and file formats and all of these things are going to be obsolete. And so you may do something that's completely state of the art today, 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's going to be laughably naive, and, somebody's going to find this file, they're not going to be able to read it, and, that's a real problem. And so you want to think about, having a plan to, migrate your materials to new formats. And, and you want to kind of think of one of the major sort of, the acronym they use is lots of copies, keep stuff safe. So you want to have it, right? On if you're going to have a digital, like a scan, maybe you have one in the cloud, and you have one on a CD or a DVD, and you have one on a hard drive somewhere. And basically you want lots of copies of things. And then you need to periodically look at them and say, are these files still good? Are they corrupted? Are there any problems here? Are they still readable? Do I need to go get, some old hard drive out from, up in the attic storage somewhere, and we don't have this anymore? Because if you can't read the files, if it's not eye readable, then it's not particularly useful. So I think that if you're making scans or copies, to sort of share with family, so that you don't necessarily have to be have people pawing over all of your, photos or scrapbooks or photo albums and stuff like that all the time, then that's really great. And that's a really good use of technology, but you can't rely on digitization to be a preservation, technique for things that are like paper and photos and books and things that really I've been talking about today.
Yeah. Great. Also scary, but also very helpful. Yeah, and I know we've offered a digitization class in the past that sort of talked about basics, and it's a big, big topic. So hopefully we'll be able to get back to offering that at some point in the future. Another comment that we got was that someone who volunteers at the Nassau Photo Archives on Long Island, and he mentioned that they use cut envelopes to encase photos and documents. And those, I've worked at archives that also use those before, and they're a good solution for some materials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. At the NA, there's lots of, and there's, when you get into different kinds of photos and things like that, it's definitely, there are times when you might want to use paper. The benefit of using Mylar is obviously you can see the image, so you don't have to pull it out of the sleeve. Some things like negatives, especially nitrate negatives, if you have anything like that, you don't want to put that in plastic ever. That should definitely go in paper. And so, yeah, envelopes are certainly a viable thing, especially if you, and especially in like a professional archive or a repository, then you may have a photo collection that has 10,000 photos. Not everybody is ever going to go and look through every single one of those images. So it can be very cost effective to put them in envelopes, because Mylar can be very expensive.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah.
It's worth it, but it can be very expensive.
Yes, yeah. So that's, again, you want to think about, what are you preserving and how often you're going to use it, and does everything really need to be put into a sleeve? Maybe not. It really doesn't have to be. That's really a way to keep it safe for handling, rather than if it's going to sit in a box and nobody's going to look at it for years at a time, then sure, you can put it in an envelope. That's fine.
Yeah. Again, though, just keeping in mind that they are acid-free.
Right, yeah.
And I think a lot of the cut envelopes, they minimize the amount of adhesive that are involved in making them, which is adhesive, if you can avoid it, is great. So we still have time for questions. And somebody was interested in the type of envelope instead of having glued seams. So yeah, you just definitely don't want to use a regular envelope that you mail.
Right. Yeah. They make special envelopes for photographs, and they come in different sizes, and you can get all sorts of things special just for your photos.
Yeah, and you also don't want to cram envelopes, even if they are full of a giant stack of materials. You want to make sure that it's the materials, like with folders. You mentioned folder creasing, which is very important. With the envelopes, you want to make sure that your documents or your item are not too snug,
right,
and that it easily slides in and out, so that it's not bulky, because it can cause tearing and folding and things like that. Yeah, so we do have more time for questions. You covered a lot. Very fast.
Sorry.
But that's great. It's amazing to get this much into a presentation. So if you have questions, feel free. Please go ahead and type them in. Someone was kind enough to ask about some very important things. One is handouts, and we will send out handouts that include the preservation materials companies, the archival supply companies, and all the links that Gabrielle mentioned after the class. And we will also be sending out a recording, assuming that it works, So you can go back and watch sections of the program if you missed something. And then with the preservation kit, we have it here at the Thomas Balch Library. They cost $45 each. There are two versions of it. One is just a general preservation kit that has materials that Gabby showed you for preserving paper-based materials, so letters, documents, things like that. So you get the mylar sleeves and folders. We have a photo version that includes some additional types of sleeves and enclosures for different sizes of photographs. And if you're interested in that, you can give us a call, send an email to Balch Lib, or just stop by the library. We are open again 7 days a week. Our hours vary by day, but we'd love to see you. We can show you the kit in person and help you out if you'd like to purchase one. This one has gotten kind of foldy to make new time. So it looks like we have another question about red rot on books.
Right, so red rot, if you're not familiar, is something that can happen to a certain type of leather that was used to bind books. It's sort of a not very high quality leather, and it kind of turns into this red dust, and it can get everywhere. I should have a good story about red rot. When I was at the George Washington University, they got the PNC Bank, the Riggs Bank archives, and so it was the archives of this bank, all from like the 18th, 19th century, and so these huge ledger books like this, and they had hundreds of them, and we had to go over there to get them. And we had the whole thing with the coats and the gloves and masks before masks were cool, and but they were all had red rot, so this flaky red dust everywhere. And even with the masks, and basically we were wrapping them up into acid-free, these large sheets of acid-free, kind of like a craft paper, but acid-free paper, and tying them up so that they could be transported. But it was just everywhere. And after about 2 or 3 days, I just started to like sneeze and cough, red dust. It was so, even wearing a mask all day long. It was so horrible. So red rot, again, is one of these things that kind of happens. You can get a sealant that they sell that it kind of helps to prevent it from flaking off. But really, sometimes the easiest thing to do is to just box it up, put it in a phase box, and then it's not going to contaminate the rest of your collection and leave this like kind of red dust. Because it's the kind of thing you touch it and it just brushes off. It gets on your clothes, gets in your hair, gets in your lungs apparently. And so I think that's those are the two things you can do. They do have like I'm not actually sure exactly what it is, but you can kind of like brush it onto the books to it kind of seals it up.
Okay, yeah. Sometimes we will use Cellugel on ours, which is the sealing.
Yeah.
So, and it is not a permanent solution. It just re-moisturize. It's moisturizer for your books. That's what it is. Yeah. But it does make the books more handleable, and you can definitely not have to wear the protective gear.
Yeah, the whole suit.
Yeah, so a follow-up question on the archives kits. Yes, we will ship these. We can, if you email us at balchlib@leesburgva.gov, I'll be happy to figure out the shipping to send it to you. It would vary depending on where you are. So any other questions out there? If you have, we'll give you a couple seconds to type them in. I will say, if you have questions more generally about preservation or archives, I am always happy to help here at the library. Gabrielle, I know in the past has been very kind and has been willing to help with questions that people have had after the class. We're very lucky that October is Archives Month, so next Wednesday, the 13th of October, is Ask an Archivist Day. So if you go on Twitter or Facebook or any social media platform, there will be archivists there. And if you do the hashtag Ask an Archivist, one of them will probably answer you. Archivists are here at the library all week though, so we're always happy to answer your questions. Don't see any more questions right now. So do you have anything else you want to add? No? Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for attending the program, and a special thanks to Gabrielle for providing this very informative program. We got a sneaky last minute question.
Oh, postcards. Yeah, well, depending on, so postcards are, there's photographs that are printed as postcards, or they could just be a sort of photomechanical print on a postcard. You can sleeve them individually if you really want to, or you can have them in a photo box. I think that's probably fine, as long as it's an acid-free photo box and it's the right size for your postcards. You could put little spacers in between to kind of make it more rigid within the box, like little bits of board or something to kind of give it additional support if that's a problem. Sometimes, especially with, photographs or other things like that, they can kind of be warped, and then there's like this curving inside the box. So that can help with that. You could you put them in Mylar sleeves if you really want to. But again, that is very expensive if you have a lot of postcards. I mean, I think having them organized and in a photo box is fine.
Yeah, we actually put ours in a photo box here, and most of them are not in Mylar. We do try really hard to make sure they're not leaning. That is very important. So spacers, if you don't have a full box, are important.
Yeah.
Great question, though. Excellent. Okay, well, again, thank you very much. If you have other questions, please feel free to send them. Thank you very much for attending. Again, I'd like to apologize for the technical difficulties. I do know that there's been a couple comments about the sound going in and out. Here at the library, it's still a learning process with this, and we're working with some new technology. We hope to have better audio solutions in the future. So thank you very much. Please look for an email with the handouts and also with the recording of the class, and we hope you'll join us for future classes. If you have photographic materials, in November we are offering a similar preservation class for photographic materials, so keep an eye out for information about that. But thank you very much and have a great day. This is not the right